Welcome back everybody, I'm Nick930, and today I want to share with you my thoughts on Arkane Studios' latest action-adventure game, Deathloop. Deathloop is a first-person, narrative-driven shooter currently available for the Sony PlayStation 5 and PC platform. In it, players are tasked with escaping a Groundhog Day-style time loop, where the same day is repeated over and over again. Throughout the game, players will need to explore a semi-open-ended world, solve puzzles, and defeat enemies using any means at their disposal, while simultaneously upgrading their character with various new weapons and powerful abilities. It plays very much like Arkane's previous work, most notably Prey and the stealth action series Dishonored, though at the same time, it also seems to drift slightly away from its traditional immersive sim roots, leaning more heavily towards its shooter elements and combat to drive the action forward. And while most of what it sets out to accomplish works very well, there are still a few hangups that prevent the game from ever feeling fully realized. So to help you understand exactly what I mean by this, let's first start by taking a spoiler-free look at the story on offer. Deathloop takes place on the fictional Isle of Black Reef during the 1960s. The player assumes the role of Colt, who awakens mysteriously on a beach after apparently passing out drunk from the night before. Unaware of exactly what's happened, it's soon revealed that Colt and everyone else on the island are trapped in a strange, time-based phenomenon where the exact same day is repeated endlessly. To make matters worse, any attempt to try and change things is undone as soon as the sun rises the next day, presenting the player with the challenge of finding a way to break the loop before it repeats itself. To do this, the player must kill 8 characters, known as Visionaries, all within a single 24-hour period. The catch is that each of the characters have their own unique schedules to follow, so they'll only appear at specific locations at specific times of day. And because there's only 4 time periods for each location in each day cycle, it's impossible early on to string together all the necessary assassinations without a lot of careful manipulation. And it's this problem that the player will spend most of their time in the game trying to solve, as they track scripted leads from one area to the next, until they ultimately discover the one and only schedule that will get the job done. It's a really great idea, one that off the top of my head, I can't remember ever really being utilized by another game before. But unfortunately, it just doesn't feel as well realized as it could be. You're not actually piecing together pieces to a puzzle and figuring this out on your own. You're just following on-screen waypoints from point A to point B pretty much 90% of the time. And everything is solved for you automatically as soon as you pick up the necessary scrap of paper or listen to an audio log. You could technically not read a single document or listen to a single audio tape and still know exactly where to go next. What's even more odd is that the Visionaries that you're supposedly hunting down are also marked for you most of the time, with no option in the menus to disable the waypoints to make it more difficult, outside of just disabling the HUD items altogether. The point I'm trying to get to here is that Deathloop sets up this elaborate, highly unique premise, but instead of challenging players to figure out the overarching puzzle for themselves, it insists on holding their hand the whole way, taking away any genuine feeling of satisfaction after having finally pieced it all together. Then there's the characters themselves. Colt and Juliana's back-and-forth dynamic is a great concept that seems like it should perfectly complement the game's time loop premise. But more often than not, the dialogue comes off feeling a bit too forced and awkward, especially when it's coupled with some comically over-the-top first-person animations. It just doesn't come off feeling natural, even if it is intentionally ridiculous, which, based on the story's overarching tone, it definitely seems to be. The game also doesn't really spend enough time letting the player get to know these characters. The prologue makes it seem like there's going to be a lot of run-ins with Juliana where she'll appear out of nowhere and taunt Colt in unique ways. But in reality, the only interactions we get between these characters are randomized invasion encounters, along with some brief radio communication between the two during level transitions. There's just so much more that could have been done here, and it feels like most of the character development and personality is locked behind needing to find audio logs and hidden notes around the game world. I think bookending certain milestones in the player's investigation with more interesting scripted sequences, or even having some sort of special boss encounters with Juliana not based in the open world areas, would have helped to break up the monotony and allow for some critical character building moments throughout the course of the narrative. Finally, there's the ending, that again, I won't spoil or even show footage of, but just the overall payoff after completing the final act was remarkably underwhelming. It's honestly one of the more disappointing endings I've seen in a game in a while now. And as the credits started to roll, I couldn't help but feel the writers just didn't know exactly where they wanted to go with it. Sure, there's a few semi-interesting twists and maybe some philosophical questions that are raised, but nothing we haven't really seen before. Now, don't get me wrong, aside from those issues I brought up, Deathloop is still a fantastic experience. There's some very clever writing all throughout, and I especially love the mysterious messages that appear all around the environment that seem to suddenly break the fourth wall at times. But if there's ever going to be some sort of follow-up to this game, I'd certainly like to see the writers really flesh out these ideas more and give the talented voice actors a bit more to work with. Though, of course, Deathloop's story isn't all it has going for it. The gameplay experience alone is enough to justify giving it a try, as it had me completely hooked all throughout the course of its 20-hour runtime. Deathloop's core gameplay design is best described as a much faster-paced, gung-ho version of Arkane's past work with the Dishonored series. A lot of aspects of that series are retained here, like the general movement and control scheme, the small but dense level environments, and the focus on assassinating hard-to-reach targets. But instead of stalking from the shadows using a blade and crossbow, a direct approach is often just as effective in Deathloop, with Colt able to wield several different powerful firearms to take on multiple threats at once. Weapons available in the game include a few handguns, a submachine gun, some shotguns, a light machine gun, and a bolt-action rifle, all of which have different tiers of quality and perks that may suit certain playstyles. To help add a little bit more variety, Deathloop also has a few special unique weapons, only available by completing optional side objectives throughout the game. And considering how much more versatile and powerful these unique weapons are, it's definitely worth the detour whenever possible. But even with these unique weapons, the overall arsenal is a bit lackluster when compared to more conventional shooter titles. There's just not enough variety here to keep things fresh throughout the course of the game. And once you find a weapon that complements your style of play, whether that be close quarters action or silent mid-range headshots, there's very little reason to experiment with other weapons. Thankfully, these guns aren't the only thing up Colt's sleeve. Just like in Dishonored, players can also equip several powerful tools and powers in their left hand. There's a grenade that can be toggled to swap between different modes like a trip mine or a proxy mine, a hacking device that can reprogram security systems to target enemies within range, and a few powerful abilities called slabs that can be acquired by killing any of the 7 main targets, and enhanced further by killing those same targets over and over again. The teleport slab, for example, allows players to quickly travel a short distance in any direction relative to where the player aims the cursor. But if the player kills the same target that holds this slab again, and assuming they took the necessary steps to hold on to the base ability, then the target will drop an upgrade for this power to make it stronger, like being able to teleport further distances, swap places with enemies, or even freeze in midair to more easily access out-of-reach areas. Other powers include things like invisibility, increased damage resistance, and one of my favorites, the Nexus, where enemies can be linked together so that any damage inflicted upon one of them directly impacts the rest. Once a player starts to get comfortable with all these different guns, powers, and tools, Deathloop's gameplay potential really starts to come through. It's so easy to zip across rooftops, slide around corners, and drop onto enemies with style, that it's often easy to get distracted trying to pull off cleaner kill combos throughout the course of the day. However, at the same time, it can also be a bit dangerous to veer off course, especially when considering Deathloop doesn't offer players any sort of conventional checkpoint or quick save feature. That means if you die, you run the risk of being sent all the way back to square one, with Colt awakening on the beach the next morning, and all of the progress seemingly reset. Thankfully, there are a few caveats to this. For one, any information that the player learns does not get reset. This includes things like notes, audio logs, various clues to advance leads, and most importantly, door codes that can be used to open shortcuts and skip any needless repetitive action. Additionally, as players explore the world of Black Reef, they'll also run into some strange glowing anomalies that can be absorbed in order to collect a currency called Residium. This Residium can then be used in between missions to infuse anything that the player wants, ensuring that even if the player does get killed, that infused item will remain in their inventory for later use. So, for example, if you find a gun that you really like and don't want to lose, you can save up Residium and infuse it before the next day starts, and that gun will always be available to equip. The same is true for any powerful slabs, perks, and upgrades. Meaning, by the end of the game, you should have a pretty healthy inventory of saved gear to choose from, so much so that dying is only a minor inconvenience. The only parts of the game that can never be saved between days is progress made killing the Visionaries. The Visionaries must be killed within a single loop, so if you miss an opportunity to kill one of them, then you'll be forced to skip to the next day and start all over. If that wasn't enough, there's also the matter of Juliana to contend to. Juliana adds a really interesting twist to this whole situation. While Colt is out searching for Visionaries to kill, Juliana's only job is to hunt down Colt. This is incorporated into the game as a sort of invasion mode, where Juliana, either controlled by an AI or by a player, depending on the easily toggleable options in the menu, will spawn into the world and actively pursue the player. When this happens, the player's only choice is to either kill Juliana, which is risky but often worth it for her valuable loot, or they can try and flee, which requires that the doors be hacked open first before heading for an exit. I think this is a great idea, and probably one of the better uses of the online invasion concept. Though, my only gripe with the system is that because of its inclusion, Deathloop by default doesn't have a way to safely pause the game. At one point, I thought I had paused the game to go eat dinner, only to return later and see that an AI-controlled Juliana had randomly spawned and killed me, resetting all of the progress I had made and sending me back to the start. It was a solid hour's worth of progress that was lost, and having to go through and collect all the same residium and other items and retrace my steps felt like a needless chore. Now, you can set the game to an offline mode, which will allow the pause option to function correctly. But it's still annoying that this needs to be toggled at all, considering older games like Watch Dogs, that featured invasion modes as well, would automatically disable this invasion mode whenever the game was paused, assuming someone hadn't already invaded, that is. Next, let's talk briefly about the technical side of things, starting with the graphical presentation. Deathloop, while not the most technically advanced game available today, has a fantastic visual style. The game is beautifully detailed, with some great color composition, really fun environmental designs, and some incredible geometric complexity, making things like rocky cliff faces really stand out. And the game's lighting design really helps to bring the world to life. I especially love the surface reflections used along the metallic finishes of certain weapons that gives this game a very next-gen feel. Sadly, that's where the praise on the technical side seems to end. While a lot of the visual design elements can be excused because of the slick art direction, it's hard to ignore the overly simplistic artificial intelligence here. The AI feels remarkably outdated, responding to only the most basic disturbances. They have the visual and auditory range of a cheap web camera. You can kill a group of enemies in a high-intensity firefight only a few yards away from a patrol, and you won't even notice sometimes. The ragdoll physics also feel a bit off at times, causing enemies to fling in unnatural directions, however funny it may look. But the real problems become clear when playing on the PC platform. I've tested this now on both my AMD build and my Intel Nvidia setup, and in both instances, the game struggles to maintain a smooth gameplay experience. The average frame rates I received when playing at 4K were typically in the 80 FPS range, but even at that seemingly high average, the game feels sluggish and regularly dips down in more complex areas. It's basically a requirement to turn on AMD's Fidelity FX, which is designed to automatically adjust the internal resolution of the game's assets to achieve a target frame rate. But when this is enabled, I often ran into instances where the game would turn into a blurry mess when moving between two large areas, and sometimes it would even get stuck for a while before returning to normal. An even bigger problem though that I ran into regularly throughout the course of my playthrough was an easily reproducible crash whenever sorting through weapons and perks in the loadout menu. As it turns out, the only way I could avoid the game crashing was by limiting the frame rate to at most 45 frames per second when using these menus, and then re-enabling the vertical sync after I was done making changes. It's a very tedious process, especially considering how often you'll find yourself using these menus, so a fix for this should be a top priority. It's because of these technical hiccups that I highly recommend the PlayStation 5 version instead, at least for the time being. Sure, it doesn't have the fancy ray trace shadow effects in its high frame rate mode, but it will at least feel nice and smooth, crash less often, and will also make use of the DualSense's haptic feedback triggers. Overall, Deathloop is a game that I really want to love, but there's just so many little problems that seem to be holding it back. The story and the characters are all very interesting, but the execution seems to miss the mark by a decent amount, with ideas that don't seem to come full circle by the time the credits roll. Then, there's the few questionable choices made in regards to the gameplay design, including a small selection of weapons, some really simplistic enemy AI, and objectives that try to hold the player's hand way too often. And on top of all of this, the game feels largely unstable in its current state, with regular crashing, average performance levels, and other minor bugs. But even with all of these issues piled on top of each other, there's still a fantastic game hidden underneath. As I said before, I found myself hooked from start to finish, eager to improve my techniques with each loop cycle, finding more powerful versions of my favorite weapon types and dodging shots from the occasional Juliana invader. Arkane has always pushed the envelope with their games, giving players all the necessary toys and a playground to run around in that makes no two playthroughs ever feel the same. And despite having essentially replayed the same levels a dozen times over just to reach the ending, I'm still looking forward to returning to the Isle of Black Reed. But what do you guys think? Is Deathloop all you were hoping it would be? If not, what about it don't you like? Let me know in the comments section, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more content posted every week.